If for some reason you don't know what Hamilton is or you have not watched it on Disney Plus, then I highly suggest you get on that. Because as you guys know, Hamilton has been released only a week ago, not today, but I digress. Hamilton the musical, obviously, it's a revolutionary show, and if you don't know what the plot is, I'm not gonna tell you because you should know that by now, Broadway fans, stands, and everyone else in between. And like every other piece of entertainment, TV show, or movie, Hamilton has come under scrutiny and the very, very dangerous cancel culture. Yes, I know, the cancel culture, it can cancel. That's what the hashtag and the movement is about. But the show has been called out, and why, you may ask? Well, here's the thing. The creators of the show left out the fact that the founding fathers, the main characters of Jefferson, Burr, Hamilton, and especially Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, were either complicit or owned slaves. And this has been a huge debate, especially in America today, with taking down Confederate statues, honoring people that either wanted to keep slavery or that simply owned slaves. Statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson have been taken down, and of course there's a whole political debate going on about that. And that's kind of where that political debate has come into Hamilton, is why are we going to pay top dollar to see a musical that kind of glorifies these founding fathers, but yet we're taking down the statues? And that's a big topic that's going to be addressed in this video. And here's the thing, guys. Hamilton, there's a lot of topics to range from. For example, the motifs of the show. Does the dancing mean? Why is Hamilton's eyes so seductive to so many people, including Burr? Is the show glorifying these founding fathers and whitewashing it using black bodies and using hip-hop as a way to make the elitist white people feel better about themselves and feel like they've struggled? All of these topics are very, very, very deep. And again, I'm gonna say it, guys, I'm gonna do a Hamilton essay videos. Basically what's gonna happen is I cannot cover all these topics in one video, and if I did, it would be over an hour long probably. And you Gen Z people, kids, teens, whatever, seem to have a pretty bad attention span. So that's why I'm going to be dividing them into mini video essays. So in this first video essay, we are going to be going over cancel culture's problem with Hamilton. And here are the big questions that is going to be answered in this video, or in my opinion. And that's this. 1. Does Hamilton sanitize and otherwise whitewash the founding fathers to make them seem better than they actually were? 2. Is Hamilton historically accurate, and basically fact versus fiction, and find out what is historically accurate and what's more embellished about these fathers? 3. Should we be tearing down these statues but also closing the show, and are they the same thing? Personally, I think the statues and the show are two very different things that represent two very different ideas, but we'll get into that in a further video or in this video. And the fourth and final question is this. Should we take Hamilton the musical as historical fact or as historical fiction that is using these characters as symbols and manifestations of American ideas and political agendas? I know, deep topics for a 16-year-old, but anyways, let's go into the video. So please like, subscribe, and comment, and let's get our Hamilton on. So I'm not going to give you a history lesson on all these people, but I'm going to be answering some of the major questions. And the first one, was Hamilton anti-slavery? Well, kind of. So one of the big lines in the show Hamilton says is he calls himself and his friends revolutionary manumission abolitionist. I don't know how to speak, guys. Anyways, I digress. I have a list, but someone said that in the comments. I'm moving on. Anyways, Hamilton was actually anti-slavery, despite some scholars saying the intensity of his opposition has been overstated. He was a founding member of the New York Manumission Society, created in 1785. This society pushed for a gradual releasing of slaveries, that is, if the enslavers decided, hey, we're gonna let you free. However, the full let's get rid of slavery forever is something that Hamilton did not advocate for. And as the show indicates, Hamilton did support John Lawrence's 1779 plan to allow black soldiers to fight in the Revolution, and many eventually did, but that's as far as it went in terms of him supporting him. Hamilton was a man who did good and bad, and maybe cruelty by simply not doing enough when he had the power to do more. This is referring more to slavery. But it might be wishful thinking on the part of Miranda and Philip pursues Eliza at the end of the musical to say if Hamilton hadn't died, he could have done so much more. But by the time he had been shot, his time had passed. Hamilton was a forward thinker for his time. He understood slavery and the basic tenets of racism that white society used to rationalize it. He said it was insidious. But he made not a lot of effort to fight it, and like a lot of white men throughout history, and even today, he ultimately placed it on the back burner as something that was a priority, but not the biggest priority, when in reality, it should have been. While living in the Caribbean islands, he did develop a strong distaste for slavery, seeing a lot of it as there was a lot of slavery there. And his ability to express vocal outrage over slavery impressed merchants early in his career. And for someone in the 18th century who was a white man who opposed slavery, that was pretty progressive, though by today's standard, it's pretty much any person that's not a white supremacist or racist or a current or interim president. Even though he had this knowledge, he did not make it his highest priority. His dear friend John Lawrence did speak out against slavery and attempted to free 3,000 slaves if they fought for the Continental Army, beginning with the 40 slaves he stood to inherit from his father, Henry Lawrence, president of the Continental Congress. Let's not get into John Lawrence just yet, though. But here is the basis, the summary of what I've been saying. Hamilton, for his time, was pretty progressive, okay? He was not a perfect man, and he definitely, when he married Eliza, their family owned slaves, so he was complicit in slavery. But the thing is he did not use the power that he held to end slavery and really bring about a very meaningful movement against owning slaves. And the thing is that Hamilton was someone that, again, had the power to do it, but basically said, I'm going to put this on the back burner because this is not my top priority. And it's as simple as that. The second question, so what characters actually own slaves? And the answer is pretty much all of them. So, in one of the cabinet rap battles, Jefferson says that the South's economy is really thriving, and Hamilton slaps back by saying, yeah, keep ranting, we know who's really doing the planting, dismissing it as a civics lesson from a slaver. Now, Thomas Jefferson is probably the worst person in the show, and I definitely do think that the play characterizes him as an antagonist rather than a protagonist. And Jefferson was a Democrat, was a hypocrite on the issue of slavery. He said all men are created equal, yet he owned slaves, I think had a daughter with a slave, and I believe he did in fact rape slaves and treated them very poorly, and really was not all for all men were created equal, and did a lot of horrific, terrible things, and definitely is not someone who should be symbolized and put on a pedestal. Thomas Jefferson is a man of contradictions. One moment he's saying, I oppose slavery and it's disgusting, but at the same time, he owned slaves and was born into a family that was a slave-owning family. So in summary, Thomas Jefferson was a pretty terrible person, and I actually would suggest you watching or even reading articles about the man, because he did do a lot of good stuff for this country, but ultimately he was a really bad person that contradicted himself constantly and he was not a good guy. You guys should not be doing fan art of Thomas Jefferson, because he was actually a pretty terrible guy, and I think the show does a good job of conveying how much of a jerk he is to most of the characters. And slavery was not just a southern affair. New York City was full of slaves, and in 1790, about 40% of households in New York City included enslaved people. A fact that the show fails to mention, that New York City, at that time the show takes place, owned a ton of slaves. Aaron Burr, Hercules Mulligan, all owned slaves, though later Aaron Burr denounced slavery, guys, I'm lisping. Aaron Burr denounced slavery, and was actually the most progressive out of all of them. And Hercules Mulligan, also owned a slave called Cato, I hope I said that right, who worked alongside him, in an anti-British spy ring, and his slave was the one that was actually the one that was most responsible for getting the information to him. And I do wonder why they failed to omit that from the narrative. But again, the show is presenting these characters as against slavery, as progressive, and they're definitely embellishing their beliefs, which is a good thing in a sense that it kind of, makes these people vessels for, anti-slavery and with immigrants and spreading these liberal ideas, but I think that you put them on a pedestal that they really shouldn't be on. It's not also historically accurate. But again, I definitely do think that Lin was creating a fantasized version of who these people actually were. The Schuyler family owned slaves so much. They were there was the statue of Philip Schuyler that was brought down because he owned as many as 27 slaves. And Hamilton helped with their slavery-related transactions, including the $225 purchase of a mother and a child for Angelica Schuyler and her husband. Angelica Schuyler actually was for slavery, and Eliza was born into that, but later on, spoke against it. But again, they do fail to mention that the Schuyler sisters were against slavery. But again, I think we have to remember, this show main point is not about slaves and slavery, and they are taking that stuff out because it wouldn't fit the narrative that Hamilton is trying to push, which is a more fantasized version of who these people were. And rather than taking these characters and just plopping them on stage, they're taking what they believed in and what they want to accomplish and using them to create a new character and as a vessel to promote these ideas of immigrants who get the job done, opposing slavery, very progressive liberal ideas that this country definitely does need. But again, not historically accurate, and I definitely do think they could have done a better job at making them not putting them on a pedestal. But the show doesn't really put most of these characters on a pedestal except George Washington. But we'll get to him in a minute. Now, while Hamilton didn't personally own slaves when he married Eliza had a slave-owning family, so obviously he was complicit in it. And despite the fact that he hated it, again, he did not put that as his top priority, and ultimately accepted protecting slavery in the Constitution to solidify the union of the North and the South, which was crucial to the financial growth that Hamilton envisioned. Hamilton did see himself as an immigrant, or rather an outsider, as many people perceived him that way. And he really wasn't an immigrant, rather he went from one British colony to another and then to America. So again, this was another way of Lin-Manuel taking an idea and embellishing it to use as a method of storytelling and a way to relate to other people. Because Hamilton was technically an immigrant, but by contemporary standards, not really. But this idea was a good idea of, making Hamilton into the manifestation of a successful immigrant who can do good on this world. But again, the show addresses that Hamilton is an elitist, and if you look at some of the lyrics of the show, especially Jefferson, he says how elitist you are and you're for big banks, and that idea is definitely portrayed in the show. But I think Hamilton sees himself as not that, and Jefferson sees him as he truly was very elitist and for national banks and government control. And so they portray both sides of him in this musical. You just have to listen to the lyrics and really figure out and understand what they're saying, but that is stated in the show. It's kind of weird that this show is both a relic of the past and a relic of the future. There's a great cut song called Cabinet Battle 3, and Hamilton calls out Jefferson on him owning slaves, but Jefferson says, but you own slaves, and do you want to have that conversation? And Hamilton says no, and that's how the song ends. And that perfectly summarizes this show. This show doesn't want to have that conversation about slavery and about them owning them. Which I think is kind of an idea, a relic that America had before now of we don't really want to look too much into who these people were. We don't really want to know that big holidays like the 4th of July and Thanksgiving have very racist undertones and people weren't really free, and how messed up our history really is. But at the same time, there's a great line in My Shot where Lawrence says, one of these colonies is going to rise up, and in the story of tonight, they'll never take freedom is something they can never take away, and how much you can easily relate those lines, those quotes, those ideas to today in the Black Lives Matter movement, and seeing signs where it's quoting Hamilton lines where this is not a moment, it's a movement. So again, the ideas that Hamilton is conveying just through the lyrics and that famous quote, immigrants, we get the job done, is why this show is beyond the statues. That's why it's beyond that. It's because Hamilton the musical, what it's symbolizing, what it stands for, is the complete opposite of what these founding fathers stood for. George Washington, he was born to a very wealthy family. He owned slaves his whole life, and he did speak out against it, but like Thomas, he was very contradictory and, still owned slaves, and ultimately he did set the slaves free on his deathbed, but the slaves could only stay with his wife. And Chris Jackson in an interview said that he bows his head when Eliza says, I fought for slavery, as kind of a way to say, how Washington failed in his efforts to stop slavery. And Washington, was not a good man by any accounts, and I definitely do think, if anything, the one character that is glorified in the show is Washington, in the sense that they kind of make him to be this fatherly figure who can do no wrong, and, we're so sad when he leaves. And knowing this information, my view on the character has changed, but I think that, again, they've taken George Washington's as a character, but that the character we're seeing of George Washington in Hamilton is in no way resembling the George Washington that was. It's taking his beliefs, his ideas, and manifesting it into this fictionalized character of this idyllic version of him. And Burr was actually the one that was the most progressive. He did fight for the little guy and wanted to give more votes to the people than the rich. He fought for freedom of the press, which is something that obviously we all should have. He fought for the freeing of slavery, and even though he was a slave holder, he did try to get a bill passed in 1785 calling for the immediate freeing of all slaves. He fought for women. He was one of the few founding fathers who believed in the rights of women, and ultimately he was actually the most progressive character in the show, and yet he's the one that's portrayed as the antagonist of the piece. Lafayette and Lawrence were actually against slavery, and the show does portray them very accurately as well. So to put in summary this long rant of a video, and I know I said rant twice, but I don't care, it's 3:21 a.m. and I'm doing this for YouTube. In summary, Hamilton the musical is not this very woke political show that people want it to be. And that's the whole point, is that Hamilton is not meant to question or really deconstruct the founding fathers. There will be a musical like that will definitely happen, but Hamilton is a show that is meant to inspire change through its lyrics and its political agendas, and you have to fill in the gaps themselves. Hamilton was written in 2015 when Barack Obama was president of the United States, when there was a lot of hope, optimism, the American dream. No one was questioning the founding fathers. No one was deconstructing or really looking into the uncomfortable past and asking these uncomfortable questions. So you can't really blame the creators for not, thinking about that. If the show had been written now, I'm sure it would have been done a lot differently. But this show is not a deconstruction, but rather a biography of who these people were. And again, this show is not historically accurate. It's purely a work of historical fiction. And these characters are not meant to be historically accurate characters, but rather it's taking the beliefs and ideals of what these real people wanted to do, but either failed to do, didn't want to do, or simply just put it on the back burner, and created a vessel, which is Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, Leslie Odom Jr., Lin-Manuel Miranda, and embellishing these ideas in order to create a very progressive, heroic Hamilton, along with his other characters. But they don't present these characters as perfect people. I mean, Hamilton is certainly not presented as a perfect person. Thomas Jefferson is a real jerk in the show. Aaron Burr does nothing for most of the show. The only person that I think, in my opinion, is put on a pedestal when he shouldn't be is George Washington. I think a lot of people want Hamilton to be a deconstruction of the Founding Fathers, when in reality, that was not the point of the show. The point of the show was to inspire people to take up arms and be exactly like these Founding Fathers were hundreds of years before us. Just like Trump's terrible speeches inspire white supremacy, sentiments of go back to where you come from, and this is Trump's America, Hamilton has inspired many Americans to welcome immigrants, to stand up for what they believe in, to stand up for the revolution, to use the quotes that this show has written as messages against Donald Trump and his racist remarks. Hamilton is the equivalent to the anti-Trump on almost every single level, and that's why this show is vastly important. Like, subscribe, and comment. I cannot wait for part 2 of Hamilton Essay.